Washington, District of Columbia, March 14, 1983. The morning frost clung to the windows of the Meridian Tower on Connecticut Avenue, just 6 blocks from the White House, as Frank Delaney unloaded his toolbox from his battered Ford pickup truck. He was 47 years old, with calloused hands and a methodical mind shaped by 3 decades of working on elevator systems in the nation's capital. Frank believed elevators were honest machines that followed predictable patterns, moved in straight lines, and never lied about where they were going. He had no idea how catastrophically wrong that assumption would prove to be. On that frigid morning, as commuters rushed past him into the 13-story office building, Frank was simply responding to a maintenance call about an elevator making unusual sounds between the 8th and 9th floors. It seemed routine. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Frank Delaney had been working on elevators since he was 17, learning the trade from his uncle in Boston before moving to Washington in 1958. Over the years, he had serviced elevators in the Capitol building, the old executive office building, and countless private office towers that had sprung up during the construction boom of the 70s. He knew the quirks of every major elevator manufacturer, could diagnose problems by sound alone, and took pride in never leaving a job until it was done right. His reputation for thoroughness had made him the preferred contractor for several building management companies in the downtown area. The Meridian Tower was a relatively new building, completed in 1978. It housed a mix of legal firms, consulting agencies, and import-export businesses. The architecture was typical of its era, functional concrete and glass with narrow windows, and a lobby decorated in browns and oranges that were already looking dated. Frank had serviced the building's 3 elevators several times over the past few years, usually for minor issues. The building manager, a nervous man named Walter Brennan, had called him the previous afternoon. Walter has a problem, Frank thought, as he signed in at the security desk in the lobby. The guard, an elderly man named George, who Frank had known for years, barely looked up from his newspaper. "Everything okay, George?" Frank asked, noting that the usually chatty guard seemed distracted. George glanced around the empty lobby before leaning forward. "Frank, you notice anything strange about this building lately?" he asked in a low voice. "Strange how?" Frank replied, genuinely curious. George shook his head. "Maybe nothing. Just some of the tenants have been acting odd, real secretive, and I could swear I've seen people in the building at night who aren't on the sign-in sheets." He paused. "Just keep your eyes open, okay?" Frank nodded, filing the information away, and headed to the elevator bank. The middle elevator, designated as Car B, was the one with the reported issue. He pressed the call button and waited. When the doors opened, he stepped inside and immediately noticed something unusual. The elevator control panel showed buttons for floors, basement 1 through 13, but when he looked at the position indicator above the panel, he saw something he had never noticed before in this building. There was a tiny gap barely visible between the buttons for the 8th and 9th floors. Frank ran his finger along the panel. The gap was real, about 1/4 of an inch, perfectly straight and clean. In 30 years of working on elevators, he had seen this kind of gap only a handful of times, and it always meant the same thing. There was a hidden floor, accessible only by a special key or code sequence. His heart rate increased slightly. Hidden floors were not uncommon in high-security buildings, corporate headquarters, or government facilities, but the Meridian Tower was just an ordinary office building. Why would it need a concealed floor? Frank pressed the button for the 8th floor and rode up, listening carefully to the machinery. The elevator moved smoothly until it approached the 8th floor. Then he heard it, a subtle grinding sound, almost like gears shifting under load, followed by a brief hesitation before the elevator completed its ascent. The doors opened onto the 8th floor, a typical office corridor with beige carpet and fluorescent lighting. Frank held his hand against the door to keep it open and leaned out to look at the floor indicator in the hallway. It read 8 as expected, but when he looked up at the ceiling of the elevator shaft through the small inspection window at the top of the car, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There was a door. Not a regular floor door, but a heavy steel door, painted the same color as the shaft walls to make it nearly invisible. It was positioned exactly between the 8th and 9th floors, and it had no external call button, no floor indicator, nothing to suggest its existence to casual observers. Frank stepped back into the elevator and let the doors close. His mind raced. This was not standard construction. Hidden floors required special permits, special inspections, and had to be documented in the building's elevator maintenance records. He pulled out his worn folder containing the Meridian Tower's elevator specifications and maintenance history. There was no mention of any intermediate floor between 8 and 9. Someone had modified this elevator system after the initial installation, and they had done it without proper documentation. That was not just unusual, it was illegal. More importantly, it suggested that whatever was on that hidden floor was something people wanted to keep very, very secret. Frank pressed the button for the 9th floor and rode up, again listening carefully. This time he paid attention to the distance traveled. The elevator moved farther than it should have for a single floor. He estimated the car traveled at least 18 feet, when a typical floor-to-floor distance was only 12 to 13 feet. The hidden floor between 8 and 9 had to be at least 12 feet tall, maybe more. When the doors opened on the 9th floor, Frank stepped out and looked around. This floor housed a law firm with glass doors bearing the name Whitmore, Patterson and Associates. Through the glass, he could see a reception area with leather chairs and abstract art on the walls. Everything looked perfectly normal. He took the stairs down to the 8th floor, counting steps as he went. 19 steps. That confirmed his suspicion. A standard floor-to-floor stairway was usually 13 to 15 steps. The extra steps meant there was definitely a concealed floor between 8 and 9. Back on the 8th floor, Frank studied the ceiling tiles. In one corner, he noticed a section where the tiles looked slightly newer than the surrounding ones, and the metal grid holding them was heavier gauge. That would be directly below the hidden floor. Whatever was up there was heavy enough to require structural reinforcement. Frank returned to the elevator and rode it back down to the lobby. He needed to access the elevator machinery room, which was typically located on the roof or in the basement. In the Meridian Tower, the machinery room was in the basement, next to the parking garage. He retrieved his larger toolbox from his truck and headed down. The basement was dimly lit, with concrete walls and the smell of motor oil and dust. The elevator machinery room was locked, but Frank had a master key that worked on most standard elevator rooms in the city. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room contained the motors, cables, and control systems for all 3 elevators. Frank went directly to Car B's control panel. What he found there made his mouth go dry. Someone had installed a sophisticated bypass system with additional relays, timers, and a coded access panel that he had never seen in any elevator system before. This was not standard equipment. This was custom work, probably costing tens of thousands of dollars, and it had been expertly integrated into the existing system. Frank examined the wiring carefully. The bypass system appeared to be connected to a separate power supply, ensuring that the hidden floor's elevator access would work even if the building's main power failed. There was also a complex keying system that prevented the elevator from stopping at the concealed floor unless a specific code was entered on the control panel inside the car. He pulled out his camera, an old 35mm that he carried for documenting his work, and began taking photographs of the control panel, the bypass system, and the wiring. He was so focused on his task that he did not hear the door open behind him. "Can I help you with something?" a voice said, cold and flat. Frank spun around. A man stood in the doorway, mid-30s, wearing an expensive suit but with the posture and watchful eyes of someone trained in security or military work. Behind him, Frank could see another man, larger and more obviously muscular, blocking the exit. "I am the elevator repairman," Frank said, keeping his voice steady. "Building manager called me about a noise in Car B. Just doing routine diagnostics." He gestured at his tools spread out on the floor. The first man stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the control panel, and then locking onto the camera hanging around Frank's neck. "Is it routine to photograph elevator machinery?" he asked. Frank's mind raced. "For insurance purposes, yes," he replied. "If I need to order parts, the photos help me explain exactly what I need. Standard practice." The man did not look convinced. "What company do you work for?" he asked. Delaney Elevator Services, Frank answered. Been working in this building for 5 years. You can check with Walter Brennan, the building manager. He called me yesterday. The two men exchanged glances. The first man seemed to make a decision. Mr. Delaney, I'm going to need that camera and the film inside it, he said. This is a secure building, and photography is not permitted in the mechanical areas without prior authorization. Frank felt a surge of fear, but also anger. This is an elevator machinery room, not Fort Knox, he said. I have every right to document my work. Nevertheless, the camera, please, the man repeated, holding out his hand. Frank considered his options. He was trapped in a basement room with two men who were clearly not ordinary office workers. Fighting would be pointless and dangerous. Slowly, he reached for his camera, opened the back, and pulled out the film, exposing it to light and ruining whatever images he had captured. He handed both the film and the camera to the man. Thank you for your cooperation, the man said, his tone unchanged. Now, what exactly were you looking for down here? Just the noise issue, Frank lied. Sounds like a bearing problem in the main motor. I will need to order parts. Should have it fixed by next week. The man studied him for a long moment. Mr. Delaney, how long have you been working on elevators, he asked. 30 years, Frank replied. Then you are a professional. Professionals know when to fix what they are asked to fix and when to ignore things that are not their concern. The man's tone carried an unmistakable threat. Do you understand what I am saying? Frank nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. Good, the man continued. You will submit your invoice for the bearing repair to the building manager through normal channels. You will not mention this conversation to anyone. You will not return to this machinery room except to install the new bearing, and you will call ahead before you do so. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Frank said. The two men stepped aside to let him pass. Frank gathered his tools, acutely aware of their eyes on him, and left the machinery room. His hands were shaking as he climbed the stairs back to the lobby. Something very wrong was happening in the Meridian Tower, and those men had just made it abundantly clear that asking questions would be hazardous to his health. But Frank Delaney had not survived 3 decades in a dangerous profession by ignoring problems. Elevators were supposed to be safe, predictable, and documented. What he had discovered in that building was none of those things, and after 30 years of honest work, he found he could not simply walk away from something that felt so fundamentally wrong. He sat in his truck for several minutes, thinking. Those men were not building security. They were too professional, too controlled, and too concerned about a simple elevator repairman taking photographs. And that hidden floor, with its expensive custom controls and backup power system, suggested something far more serious than just a private storage area or executive suite. Frank started his truck and drove to his small office in Arlington, a converted garage behind his house where he kept his files and spare parts. His wife, Mary, was at her job at the elementary school. He had a few hours to think without distraction. In his office, he pulled out a city directory and looked up the tenants of the Meridian Tower. The 8th floor was occupied by something called the Horizon Trading Company, which the directory listed as an import-export business specializing in industrial equipment. The 9th floor was the law firm he had seen. The directory showed no tenant for any intermediate floor, which was not surprising given that the floor officially did not exist. Frank called a friend of his, Eddie Martinez, who worked for the city's building inspection department. After some small talk, he casually asked if Eddie remembered anything unusual about the Meridian Tower's construction or any modifications made after the building opened. Meridian Tower, Eddie repeated, thinking. Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, there was something odd. Back in 80, maybe 81, there was a permit application for some structural work on the 8th floor. The application was flagged for federal review, which almost never happens with private commercial buildings. Then it just disappeared from the system. I figured the owners withdrew the application. Federal review, Frank asked. What would trigger that? Usually only happens when there is some national security concern, Eddie replied. Like if the building is near sensitive government facilities, or if a tenant is doing classified work. Why do you ask? Just curious, Frank said. I am working on the elevators there and noticed some unusual modifications to the system. Wanted to make sure everything was properly documented. Well, if there is federal involvement, the documentation might be sealed, Eddie told him. You know how that goes. Some three-letter agency decides something is classified, and suddenly even the building's blueprints become state secrets. After hanging up, Frank sat at his desk, staring at his notes. Federal involvement, sealed documentation, a hidden floor with sophisticated access controls, men who were clearly trained security personnel threatening an elevator repairman over a few photographs. The pieces were forming a disturbing picture. The year was 1983. The Cold War was at one of its tensest points, with President Reagan calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, and both superpowers engaged in an escalating nuclear arms race. Frank read the newspaper every morning. He knew about the Soviet shoot-down of Korean Airlines Flight 007 the previous September, killing all 269 people aboard. He knew about the deployment of American Pershing missiles in Western Europe and Soviet threats of retaliation. He knew that espionage and counter-espionage operations were being conducted on American soil by both sides. And now he knew that there was a secret floor in an office building 6 blocks from the White House, a floor that the federal government seemed to be protecting, operated by men who were very serious about keeping it hidden. Frank made a decision. He would report what he had found, but he needed to be careful about how he did it. Going to the police seemed pointless. If federal agencies were involved, local law enforcement would just refer him back to those same agencies. He needed to contact someone higher up, someone who would take the information seriously. He thought about George's comment that morning about seeing people in the building at night who were not on the sign-in sheets. That suggested surveillance, possibly by federal agencies watching the building's activities. If that was true, then perhaps those agencies already knew about the hidden floor, but had not yet moved against whoever was operating there. Frank decided to write everything down, creating a detailed report of what he had discovered. If something happened to him, the report would ensure that others could follow up. He spent the next 2 hours carefully documenting the timeline, his observations, the technical details of the elevator modifications, and the encounter with the 2 men in the machinery room. The following day, Frank called the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Washington field office. He told the receptionist that he had information about possible espionage activity and needed to speak with someone in counterintelligence. After several transfers and a long wait, he was connected to a special agent named Tom Brennan, not related to the building manager, Frank hoped. "Mr. Delaney, I understand you have information to share," Agent Brennan said. His voice was professional but non-committal. Frank explained what he had discovered in the Meridian Tower, carefully laying out the technical details and his encounter with the security personnel. When he finished, there was a long silence on the line. "Mr. Delaney," Agent Brennan finally said, "I need you to not discuss this with anyone else. Not your wife, not your friends, no one. Can you do that?" "I have not told anyone," Frank replied. "Good. I am going to need you to come to our office this afternoon. Can you be here at 3 o'clock? Frank agreed and received directions to the FBI's field office on 4th Street. He spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on other work, but his mind kept returning to the Meridian Tower and what might be happening on that hidden floor. At 3 o'clock, Frank arrived at the FBI building and was escorted to a small conference room. Agent Brennan was waiting, along with 2 other men who were introduced as Agent Davis and Agent Kowalski. All 3 wore suits and had the same watchful, analytical expressions. For the next 2 hours, Frank repeated his story in exhaustive detail. The agents asked hundreds of questions, focusing especially on the technical specifications of the elevator system, the security measures he had observed, and the exact words used by the men who had confronted him in the machinery room. They asked him to draw diagrams of the control panel, the bypass system, and the layout of the basement. One of the agents left the room and returned with a series of photographs. "Do you recognize any of these men?" Agent Davis asked, spreading the photos across the table. Frank studied them carefully. After a moment, he pointed to 2 of the photographs. "These 2. They were the ones in the machinery room." The agents exchanged glances. "Are you certain?" Agent Brennan asked. "Absolutely certain," Frank confirmed. Agent Brennan gathered the photographs. "Mr. Delaney, what you have stumbled upon is part of an ongoing federal investigation. I cannot tell you the details, but I can tell you that you have provided valuable confirmation of intelligence we have been developing. Your cooperation is appreciated, and your discretion is essential." "What is on that floor?" Frank asked. "What are they doing there?" Agent Brennan shook his head. "I cannot discuss that. What I can tell you is that you may have put yourself in some danger by discovering this. The people operating on that floor are professionals, and they take security very seriously." "Have you noticed anyone following you? Any unusual phone calls, anything out of the ordinary?" Frank thought about it. "No, nothing like that." "Good. We would like you to continue your normal routine," Agent Brennan said. "If the building manager calls you back to complete the elevator repair, you should do so. Act completely normal. Do not show any unusual interest in the 8th or 9th floors. If those men approach you again, cooperate fully and contact us immediately afterward." He slid a business card across the table with a phone number handwritten on it. "This is a direct line. It is monitored 24 hours a day." Frank pocketed the card. "How long has this investigation been going on?" he asked. "Long enough," Agent Davis replied. "What you found today has accelerated our timeline significantly. We may be moving on this operation sooner than planned." Over the next several weeks, Frank tried to maintain his normal routine, but he felt increasingly paranoid. Every car that seemed to follow him for more than a few blocks made his heart race. Every wrong number call to his house made him wonder if someone was checking to see if he was home. Mary noticed his tension and asked repeatedly if something was wrong, but he deflected her questions, claiming he was just stressed about work. The building manager did call him back to install the bearing he had claimed needed replacement. Frank returned to the Meridian Tower, performed the repair in the machinery room under the watchful eyes of one of the security men, and left without incident. He noticed that the sophisticated bypass system had been partially covered with a metal panel, making it less obvious to casual observation. In early May, nearly 2 months after his initial discovery, Frank was working on a service call in a building on K Street when Agent Brennan called his paging number. When Frank returned the call from a payphone, the agent's voice was tense. "Mr. Delaney, we are executing our operation tonight. I wanted you to know because there may be some publicity, and you should be prepared for possible contact by reporters. Do not speak to them. Refer them to our public affairs office. And Mr. Delaney, thank you. Your information was crucial to this operation's success." That evening, Frank sat glued to the television news with Mary. The lead story was dramatic. Federal agents had raided an office building on Connecticut Avenue, arresting 6 people believed to be part of a Soviet espionage network that had been operating in Washington for more than 3 years. The news showed footage of FBI agents leading handcuffed suspects out of the Meridian Tower while reporters shouted questions. The reporter explained that the suspects had been using a concealed floor between the 8th and 9th stories as a base for collecting and transmitting classified information to the Soviet Union. The operation had involved sophisticated communications equipment, document photography capabilities, and direct links to the Soviet embassy. The FBI credited an anonymous tip from a building contractor who noticed irregularities in the building's construction. Mary turned to Frank, her eyes wide. "That is the building where you have been working," she said. "Frank, were you the contractor who reported them?" Frank was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "I found something that did not seem right. I reported it, that is all." Mary moved closer to him on the couch, taking his hand. "Were you in danger?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," Frank admitted. "But it is over now." The news continued with more details. The suspects were identified as nationals from various Eastern Bloc countries who had entered the United States using false identities and credentials. They had been posing as legitimate business people while running what the FBI described as a highly professional intelligence gathering operation. The hidden floor had been equipped with encryption machines, photographic equipment for copying documents, and radio transmission gear capable of sending coded messages back to Moscow. Over the following weeks, more details emerged. The Horizon Trading Company on the 8th floor had been entirely fake, a front operation established by Soviet intelligence. The law firm on the 9th floor was legitimate and had no idea what was happening in the building. The concealed floor between them had been created during what was supposed to be routine structural renovation work in 1981. with the work done by a construction crew that disappeared immediately after completion. The security men who had confronted Frank in the machinery room were identified as a former Soviet military intelligence officer and a recruited American with a background in electronic surveillance. Both were arrested and eventually convicted of espionage. The case made national headlines for several weeks. Experts commented that the operation represented one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence installations ever discovered on American soil. The hidden floor concept was particularly innovative, allowing the operatives to work in complete secrecy while appearing to be in a legitimate commercial building. Frank received a letter from the director of the FBI thanking him for his service to the nation and his courage in reporting suspicious activity, despite personal risk. The letter assured him that his identity would be protected to the extent possible, though his name would eventually appear in court documents as a witness who provided crucial technical evidence about the elevator system modifications. In June, Frank was called to testify before a closed-door congressional hearing examining how Soviet intelligence had been able to operate so freely within Washington. He explained in detail how the elevator system had been modified, the sophistication of the access controls, and the security measures that had been put in place. Lawmakers expressed shock that such an installation could be created without triggering more immediate suspicion. The case had broader implications. Building inspection procedures were revised to include more rigorous federal oversight for construction projects near sensitive government facilities. Elevator and mechanical contractors were given new training on recognizing signs of covert installations. The FBI established a hotline for contractors and building personnel to report suspicious modifications or activities. For Frank, the experience was profoundly unsettling. He had spent his entire career thinking of himself as a simple tradesman, someone who fixed machines and went home at the end of the day. He had never imagined that his routine work could intersect with international espionage and national security. But as the months passed and the immediate danger receded, Frank found himself oddly proud of what he had done. He had noticed something wrong, something that dozens of other people had walked past every day without seeing. His attention to detail, his knowledge of how elevator systems were supposed to work, and his unwillingness to ignore irregularities had helped shut down a major espionage operation. George, the security guard who had first warned Frank that something seemed strange about the building, was also quietly commended by federal authorities. His observations about people being in the building at odd hours had been correct. The Soviet operatives had been bringing in agents and materials late at night, bypassing the normal security procedures. The trial of the arrested spies took place the following year. Frank attended several days of testimony, sitting in the back of the courtroom and listening as prosecutors detailed the scope of the operation. The hidden floor had been in operation for nearly 3 years before Frank's discovery. During that time, the operatives had successfully photographed and transmitted thousands of pages of classified documents, primarily related to defense technology and NATO strategic planning. Much of the material had been obtained through traditional espionage methods, recruited sources within government agencies who provided documents in exchange for money. But the hidden floor had served as the critical node for processing and transmitting this information back to Moscow. Without it, the operation would have been much more vulnerable to detection. The lead prosecutor told the court that dismantling the spy ring had prevented incalculable damage to American national security interests. Several of the secrets that had been compromised involved weapons systems that were still in development, and their exposure to Soviet intelligence would have required costly redesigns and delays. All 6 defendants were convicted. The 2 main operatives received sentences of 40 years in prison. The others received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. None would be eligible for parole for at least a decade. Frank never sought publicity for his role. He declined interview requests from reporters and documentary producers. He simply wanted to return to his quiet life, servicing elevators and coming home to Mary each evening. But within the small community of elevator maintenance professionals in Washington, his story became something of a legend, a reminder that their work touched on aspects of the city that most people never considered. Years later, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, some additional details about the Meridian Tower operation became public through declassified documents. The hidden floor installation had been directed by a Soviet intelligence colonel who had previously run similar operations in Western Europe. The operation had been considered so valuable that the KGB had assigned some of their most experienced officers to manage it. The elevator system modifications, it turned out, had been even more sophisticated than Frank had initially realized. The control system included biometric sensors that could identify authorized users by their fingerprints on the control panel. There were also emergency destruction protocols that could incinerate sensitive materials within minutes if the floor was compromised. Only Frank's unexpected discovery and the FBI's rapid response had prevented the operatives from destroying the evidence. Frank continued working as an elevator repairman until his retirement in 1998 at the age of 62. By then, security screening for building contractors had become much more rigorous, and the procedures for reporting suspicious activities were well established. The age of trusting that everyone in an office building was exactly who they claimed to be had ended. On his last day of work, Frank serviced an elevator in the Hart Senate office building. As he rode down from the 9th floor, he looked at the control panel and noticed that all the buttons were evenly spaced. All the floor indicators were accurate, and all the machinery sounded exactly as it should. It was, he thought, how things were supposed to be, predictable and honest, and without hidden spaces where secrets could fester. The Meridian Tower still stands on Connecticut Avenue, though it has been renovated several times since the events of 1983. The hidden floor was completely removed during a major reconstruction in the late 1980s, and the building was reconfigured so that the 8th and 9th floors now align normally with no space between them. A small plaque in the lobby commemorates the FBI operation that took place there, though it does not mention Frank Delaney by name. But in the halls of the FBI's counterintelligence division, Frank's story is still told to new agents as an example of how vigilance and attention to detail can come from unexpected sources. The case file, codenamed Operation Vertical, is studied as a model of how civilian cooperation can be essential to national security operations. Frank Delaney passed away in 2012, at the age of 76 from heart failure. His obituary in the Washington Post made brief mention of his role in exposing a Cold War espionage ring, but most of his friends and family had never known the full story. At his funeral, a representative from the FBI attended quietly, sitting in the back row, a final acknowledgement of the debt the agency owed to a simple elevator repairman who had refused to ignore something that did not seem right. Mary kept the letter from the FBI director framed in their home until her own death in 2018. She would sometimes look at it and remember that cold evening in May 1983, when she had realized that her husband had been living with danger for weeks without telling her, protecting her from worry, just as he had protected his country by speaking up when something seemed wrong. The story of how an elevator repairman exposed a Soviet spy ring by noticing a flaw that should not exist became a footnote in the larger history of Cold War espionage, overshadowed by more dramatic cases involving double agents, defectors, and assassinations. But for those who knew the details, it remained a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important intelligence comes not from satellites or informants, but from ordinary people who know their work well enough to recognize when something is wrong. Frank Delaney never considered himself a hero. He had simply been an elevator repairman who noticed that the numbers did not add up, that the distances did not match, that there was space where there should not have been space. In a world of elaborate deceptions and sophisticated cover stories, it had been basic mechanical knowledge and honest observation that had unraveled a complex espionage operation. The hidden floor between 8 and 9 had been designed to be invisible, to exist in the gaps of perception that people rarely examined. But elevators, as Frank had always believed, were honest machines. They moved in measurable distances, followed predictable patterns, and could not lie about where they went. The operatives who created that concealed space had understood human psychology and security procedures, but they had underestimated the power of simple mechanical logic and the attention to detail of a skilled tradesman. In the end, it was not sophisticated intelligence work or high-tech surveillance that had exposed the operation. It was a worn folder of maintenance records, a measuring eye trained by decades of experience, and the curiosity of a man who believed that elevators should not have spaces that did not make sense. Frank Delaney had looked at a control panel and seen not just buttons and lights, but a puzzle that needed solving. That moment of professional curiosity, more than any elaborate counterintelligence operation, had brought down a spy ring that had operated successfully for years. The irony was not lost on the FBI agents who investigated the case. They had known about suspicious activity in the building for months, monitoring communications and tracking suspects, but they had not known about the hidden flaw until Frank reported it. The elevator system, so obvious and yet so overlooked, had been the perfect hiding place precisely because it was infrastructure that people used every day without really seeing. After the arrests, building security experts across the country began examining office towers with new scrutiny, looking for similar concealed spaces. A few were found, though none as sophisticated as the Meridian Tower installation. The case sparked a minor revolution in how buildings near sensitive government facilities were inspected and monitored. Frank's technical report on the elevator modifications became a training document for both FBI agents and building inspectors. His clear explanation of how the bypass system worked, complete with hand-drawn diagrams, demonstrated how professional expertise from any field could be valuable to intelligence work. The FBI began cultivating relationships with contractors and building maintenance personnel, recognizing them as potential sources of information about unusual installations or activities. The two security men who had confronted Frank in the machinery room later admitted during their trial that they had believed their intimidation had succeeded. They thought the elevator repairman had been frightened enough to forget what he had seen. It had never occurred to them that someone they viewed as merely a technician would have the knowledge to understand what he was looking at, or the courage to report it to federal authorities. That miscalculation reflected a broader failure in the Soviet intelligence operation. The operatives had been trained to deal with counterintelligence professionals, other spies, and security forces. They had created elaborate cover stories, used sophisticated tradecraft, and maintained strict operational security. But they had not adequately considered the possibility that an ordinary building contractor, someone outside the world of espionage entirely, might notice something wrong and act on that observation. Frank had never received formal training in security awareness or counterintelligence. He had simply applied the same methodical approach he used in his work every day. When something did not make sense, he investigated. When the investigation revealed something seriously wrong, he reported it to the appropriate authorities. It was, in his mind, no different from reporting a safety violation or a code compliance issue. But in the high-stakes world of Cold War espionage, that simple professionalism had had profound consequences. The documents and intelligence that the Meridian Tower operation would have transmitted to Moscow in the months after Frank's discovery could have compromised ongoing military operations, endangered intelligence assets, and shifted the strategic balance between the superpowers. His decision to report what he had found had literally changed the course of history, though in ways that could never be fully measured or publicly acknowledged. In the decades that followed, as archives opened and former intelligence officers published their memoirs, occasional references to the Meridian Tower case appeared. A retired KGB general mentioned it in a book published in 1996, describing it as a catastrophic security failure that had resulted from overconfidence and insufficient attention to physical security details. A former CIA officer wrote that the case had been a wake-up call that reminded American intelligence agencies to pay more attention to the infrastructure around them. But nowhere in these accounts was Frank Delaney mentioned by name. His role remained classified, known only to the FBI agents who had worked the case and the few officials who had access to the sealed files. He had been promised anonymity, and the government kept that promise even after his death. The official record credited an anonymous building contractor with providing the tip that led to the investigation, and that was how Frank would have wanted it. He had not reported the hidden flaw for recognition or reward. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, because his professional knowledge told him something was seriously wrong, and because he believed that some obligations transcended personal safety or convenience. That belief, more than any elaborate security system or intelligence operation, had proven to be the most effective weapon against espionage. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.